Hi, my name is Carol Foster. I'm with the Operations and Maintenance Environmental Support Unit. I am responsible for environmental compliance of our stream maintenance program. This is our annual BMP training, which is a required training, so thank you all for watching. Here at Valley Water, our stream maintenance program is governed by several federal, state, and local laws, such as the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. And all of those laws are then regulated by different environmental agencies, many of which you've heard of, such as U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the water boards. And collectively, the stream maintenance program is regulated under 8 different environmental agencies. So there's a lot of eyes watching us. And those agencies then issue us our permits. And permits are basically just approvals, formal approvals that allow us to do the work that we need to do. So in a nutshell, our permit requirements are to avoid or minimize impacts to water quality, habitat, and species. But our work can get kind of messy, and sometimes we can't avoid impacts. And so when we can't avoid impacts, we have to mitigate or make up for those impacts through our mitigation program, which includes invasive plant removal, revegetation, or in some cases, concrete removal. But if we can't avoid impacts or mitigate for those impacts, then those are considered violations, and it is a permit requirement to report any violations that we have to our permitting agencies. Violations can lead to a notice of violation, it can lead to fines or penalties, increased scrutiny from the public, and also increased oversight from our regulators. So we don't want to have violations, obviously, but sometimes they are unavoidable. So we need to follow our BMPs to the best of our ability, but when we do have violations, we need to correct those violations in a timely manner. So all illicit discharges must be corrected immediately. So any oil in the water, dirt in the water, those need to be corrected immediately. All other violations must be corrected within 10 business days or before the next rain event. So if you have a faulty silt fence or your wattles aren't in place or anything like that, you have 10 business days to fix that, or before the next rain event, whichever comes first. But how can we avoid them to the best of our ability? We follow our best management practices, or BMPs, and all of your BMPs, I'm going to go over those today in the presentation, but they are also in your SMP manual in attachment A. The first BMP I'm going to go over is Gen 18, and that's where paperwork is required on site. And that includes our permits, our SMP manual, your work orders, and also any emails or special instructions, including your biological clearance, has to be on site with you at all times. But this is the 21st century, and we have a brand new stream maintenance program manual and a few new permits, and we don't necessarily want to have to print all those out again. So if you have access to the internet while you're out on site, you could easily go to our external Valley Water website at the URL on the screen, and we'll send it out to everybody as well. And in that website is basically all of our permits and the manual for download. So if you are ever approached by a regulator and asked to show your permits, then that's what you would show them. Now on to work window BMPs, and these can be found either in attachment A of your SMP manual or in chapter 3 in a couple different tables like the one that you see here, and they can be kind of complicated. So in essence, you need to know that in-channel ground disturbing activities are allowed from June 15th to October 15th in general. Those can be extended, and in-channel means below ordinary high water. There's different rules if you're above ordinary high water or if you're just doing vegetation work, etc. So if you have any confusion about when you're allowed to do work, please give us a call and we'll help walk you through that. Now we are also allowed to do year-round work, and this can include trash and debris removal, large woody debris removal, encampment cleanups, most vegetation work, and also minor maintenance if there's no water quality impacts, and that's really the important part here, that regardless of what we do year-round, especially during the winter time, we really can't have water quality impacts. So when in doubt, please give us a call.
BMP action plans. The Water Board is now requiring SMP construction projects to have BMP action plans, which include specific instructions on which BMPs to use and where, in order to prevent water quality or other environmental impacts. Engineers prepare these BMP action plans and attach them to the work order for each construction project. This must be done prior to starting construction, and the crew leads are the ones implementing these BMP action plans, so please make sure you are reviewing these plans prior to starting work. Some BMPs must be in place prior to starting construction, such as inlet protection or rumble plates, for example. If crews have questions or recommendations for improving BMPs, please contact your project engineer. Here is an example of a BMP action plan found in your work order packet. It should have a diagram showing where to place BMPs, such as rumble plates or silt fencing, as well as written notes with more specific details to follow. And when I come out to inspect a job site, I'll have a copy of the BMP action plan, and I'll be looking to make sure all BMPs are implemented per the engineer's designs. But I do want to stress that if you are out working on a site and you have a suggestion on how to make BMPs more effective, or if you notice any issues with a BMP, please reach out to your project engineer.
So now I want to go through various BMPs for construction, such as erosion control. And erosion control is your first line of defense. It prevents soil movement by wind and water. So blankets and wattles can be used effectively to prevent erosion and hold seed or mulch in place, but they have to be anchored appropriately. They need to be removed at the end of the job if they're no longer needed. And then also permanent BMPs should be plastic free. So if you're putting in wattles that are going to be left there in the ground, then it needs to be burlap wattles, not the plastic netting. Straw mulch can be used as well to reduce erosion by wind and raindrop impact, to keep seed in place and reduce moisture loss, but it needs to be used with at least 80% coverage of the disturbed area, and the material should not be easily removed by wind. So if you're putting down straw mulch and it's just falling into the river, then your slope is too steep to use straw mulch, and you're probably going to need a blanket and wattle. We also use hydroseeding or hydraulic mulch. This is done through our vegetation field operations unit generally, and this reduces erosion by wind and raindrop impact. But seeding may not be appropriate in dry periods if there's no irrigation, so it needs to be timed appropriately, and it needs to cover 100% of the disturbed area. So if you put it down, you don't want to see any brown spots between the mulch. You need to just see green mulch. And you need to ensure the correct mixture of materials. We need to limit the amount of dust we generate on our job sites, so exposed or non-paved areas need to be watered at least twice daily if they're producing dust. Our unpaved road speed limit is 15 miles per hour. You also need to cover your loads and then clean any tracked dirt when you come off your job site onto the street. Winterization is also extremely important to prevent erosion, sediment transport, and protect water quality before rainfall. So before rainfall or when you're leaving a job site, you need to stabilize all disturbed areas. This can be done by seeding or mulching, erosion control blankets or wattles, and have those materials ready to go. So the next line of defense is our sediment control measures, and they capture and remove soil before it leaves the site. Silt fence and wattles are used for perimeter control. They are not for concentrated flow, so you don't want to put them across a channel or across a ditch. They should have continuous contact with the ground, so you should not see any daylight underneath in order for them to actually be effective. The ends must overlap. Preferably you want to trench them in, and if sediment accumulates behind the silt fence up to 50% capacity, then that sediment needs to be removed before you continue work. Inlet protection isn't something we use a lot of in the stream maintenance program because we're usually down in the streams, not up on the streets. But if you do need to use inlet protection, It should intercept and or filter sediment, and it needs to be removed at the end of the job. Don't leave materials in the gutter. Inlet protection should not cause flooding or cause sediment discharge from broken sandbags, so they need to be maintained regularly if you have a long job site. You want to keep your streets clean, and if necessary, this might include the need for exit gravel pad or rumble plate. But for small jobs, usually we just use street sweeping, which has to be done with water or even with a broom. And then, of course, we cover our loads. Our good site management BMPs include staging and stockpiling guidelines. So you want to try to keep materials and equipment on paved or previously disturbed areas whenever possible. You can't stockpile organic material for more than 7 days because it can start to smell and we get complaints. And inactive stockpiles have to be covered if they're inactive for 14 days during the dry season, or if it's during the wet season, those piles need to be covered at all times when they're not being used. On-site hazardous materials management is also very important and includes maintaining a list of hazardous materials and, of course, properly disposing any hazardous waste. We also use secondary containment, for example, underneath our generators. We do not store hazardous materials near storm drains or surface water. And then also, if you need to keep your hazardous materials on site, they need to be covered. Sanitation facilities are considered hazardous materials, so they need to be cleaned regularly, anchored if needed. We don't want them falling over, and then try not to locate them near storm drains or surface water. This can be difficult to do since we do work on creeks, but just try and make sure that they are located as far away from the channel as possible. So our work site housekeeping includes keeping our site clean and orderly. Also sweep and clear any residual vegetation or dirt from paved access roads and trails. And then remove sawdust cuttings to clear site of vegetation debris to the best of your ability. It's not always possible. And then, of course, trash needs to be collected and disposed of daily and disposed of properly. This includes cigarette butts. And then don't leave trash in your pickup beds where it's going to fly out. Spill prevention and response. So we want to prevent any chemical releases, but if a release does occur, you need to have your spill kit on site at all times, either kept on the job site or in a truck, and everyone needs to know how to use it appropriately. And if you do have a spill, you do need to inform our operations and maintenance support unit. You can call me directly. But you also need to report any hazardous spills to our hazmat hotline, and that number is shown here. And this is actually our Valley Water responders, so they'll come out and give you guidance on how to clean up a spill or help clean it up as well. Fire prevention. So fire suppression equipment needs to be available at your work site at all times or in your truck, and you need to avoid work in dry vegetation if there's high temperatures, high wind, or low humidity, basically all the conditions that make fires more likely. And this includes driving along maintenance roads. If there's a lot of dry vegetation, you don't want to spark a fire that way. And you also want to minimize noise disturbances, especially around residential areas. Your work is limited to weekdays only with exceptions, and you want to use adequate mufflers and no excessive idling of equipment. Dewatering is one of our stormwater management BMPs, and if you do need to put in cofferdams, then you want to construct them from upstream to downstream, and also prevent seepage using visqueen or some other kind of material. And you want to be mindful about what kind of materials you use in your cofferdams. So if you're on a salmonid stream, you might need to use gravel bags or sandbags in opposed to just using a dirt dam. And if you're in a tidal area, you want to install your dams at low tide, and then minimize turbidity when pumping, whether you're using cofferdams or not, but all pumps must be screened. And then remove your diversions from downstream to upstream to minimize impacts. and you want to restore your bypass areas to pre-project conditions.
Dewatering and diversion plans. All construction projects requiring dewatering and/or diversions will have a dewatering and diversion plan prepared by the project engineer. Field construction supervisors and senior maintenance workers must review dewatering and diversion plans prior to install. If there are any special instructions from the regulatory agencies or biologists, for example, engineers, please communicate this to the FCS and senior maintenance worker. And if the crews have any questions or recommendations for improvements to the dewatering setup, please contact your project engineer. Here's an example of a dewatering and diversion plan. These plans should include cofferdam locations, including if there are multiple phases and multiple dams, pump and bypass pipe sizes. It should also identify any potential issues such as location of discharges from pump stations and outfalls, which may need additional measures to ensure water quality requirements are being met. And please remember that any changes you may want to make to this plan need to first be approved by the project engineer. We do now have new requirements for diversions on sensitive fish reaches. Engineers will consult with the fisheries biologist when developing diversion plans. Biologists must be on site both when setting up a new diversion system, which you guys are all used to, but they also now have to be on site when dismantling a diversion system in order to ensure we avoid impacts to sensitive fish species when we're returning flows to the stream. During construction, the biologist must be consulted for any changes to the diversion plan or anything that may affect stream flow or substrate. And biologists, please include any special instructions on your biological clearances.
Vehicle and equipment maintenance. Basically, you want to fuel or maintain off-site if possible, or use secondary containment. Clean excessive buildup in grease on your equipment so it doesn't leak. Inspect it daily, and then also no vehicle cleaning on site unless there's no runoff. Concrete waste management includes keeping concrete slurry out of the water and off the ground. So contaminated water or soil must be cleaned immediately. Our concrete use near waterways BMP is actually part of our fish and wildlife permits, and they say that concrete must be isolated from a live stream for 30 days unless a sealant is used. So if we apply a sealant to concrete, then we just have to wait until the sealant is allowed time to dry before we allow it to touch a live stream. Sediment characterization. So sediment must be tested for contaminants before leaving a project site. We usually do that before the SMP season starts. It does not need to be tested if it's reused within 500 feet of your project site, unless it's in the Guadalupe watershed due to mercury issues. That always has to be tested. But even if we want to reuse it and it's clean enough to reuse, we still have to ask the water board for permission to reuse it, so we can't just reuse it on site unless we get that specific permission. So if you want to reuse your sediment, just let me know and I'll contact the water board. And then if you put in a ramp, go ahead and contact me as soon as the ramp is in place, and I'll have it tested because it takes a while to get results back. And that way, you, when you're done with the job, you can dispose of that material appropriately.
Handling treated wood. If you come across treated wood on your job sites, it needs to be disposed of in a special treated wood bin provided by our Environmental Health and Safety Unit, or EH&S. There's a small treated wood bin located at Winfield, but if your project needs a larger bin on site, this can also be provided by EH&S. If you are having to cut up treated wood, please reach out to EH&S and ensure you are provided with the proper personal protection equipment. You will need to collect and dispose of any wood and sawdust in the special treated wood bins. And please try to avoid contamination of nearby soils and water by keeping treated wood off of the ground. If we have a project where we know we are going to be dealing with treated wood or any other kind of hazardous material, Engineers should obtain a health and safety plan from EH&S prior to starting work and attach the plan to the work order so that everyone is aware of risks and special requirements.
So now I'm going to go into our vegetation management BMPs. Our BMP Veg 1 is to minimize local erosion from in-channel vegetation removal, which basically means that we want to protect the toe of the bank by leaving vegetation in place to the maximum extent possible. When we're conducting invasive plant removal, whether as part of an IPMP project or just our general maintenance, you want to dispose of certain invasive species properly to prevent spreading, and this includes Cape ivy, as shown in the picture on the right, also arundo. So these plants in particular, when they break off their pieces, can actually grow new plants. So we want to be very careful with that. Cape ivy must be bagged and taken to the landfill, and then you want to prevent plant material from floating downstream and recolonizing somewhere else. You want to use appropriate equipment for in-stream removal. Use low ground pressure equipment with tracked wheels to reduce impacts to the stream bed. And our standard grazing procedures are to fence off vegetation or areas to be preserved, exclude grazing animals from the stream channels and wetland habitats, or as I learned last year, we can also vacuum up their poop to reduce impacts. And grazing can be conducted all year round. Posting and notification for pesticide use includes posting in areas used by or accessible to the public, maintaining compliance with product label requirements, and including information on the date, time of application, active ingredients, or the valley water contact. We also need to remove postings after it's safe to enter a site and maintain records of neighbors with specific needs relative to notification and ensure those needs are met. So our post-project restoration BMPs, in order to restore our sites once we're done with them, we need to either seed them, which includes applying erosion control seed mix to exposed soils, down to ordinary high water mark. We don't want to apply it below ordinary high water mark. You need to use a native seed mix and seed temporary access roads or disturbed areas if suitable. We can also plant, and planting material needs to consist of locally collected native species, preferably within the same creek or watershed, and should be similar ecological setting. So following completion of maintenance activities, we are required to stabilize exposed soil to prevent erosion within 72 hours of project completion. So this is not just for right before the wet season, it's also during the summertime, to prevent dust impacts and erosion. So now I'm going to go through our cultural resources training. Our BMP for the discovery of cultural remains includes the protection of prehistoric artifacts and historic items over 50 years old. So if remains or artifacts are discovered, you need to stop work immediately within 100 feet of the find and call the O&M unit. You can either call myself or Joe. So what kind of prehistoric artifacts might you find? So you might find chipped stone tools like arrowheads or hand axes. You might find shell beads and pendants. And of course, they're not going to look this nice when they come out of the ground. They'll probably be covered in dirt, but just keep your eye out for anything that looks something similar to this. You might also find a bowl mortar and pestles or a milling slab for grinding grain. Middens or trash heaps are also considered a prehistoric artifact, and they can contain things like ash, charcoal, bone, and shells. So you want to look for darkened soil and look for different materials accumulated in that soil. You may also find bone or teeth fragments or even whole bones or whole skeletons. So if you do find anything that looks suspicious, please give me a call, and I can either have an archaeologist come out on site, or we can send them a picture and they can let us know whether it's a human bone or an animal bone. but obviously you want to stop work until we figure out what it is. And if it's an animal bone, then they can just tell us right away and we can keep working. So the historic period materials that are over 50 years old that we also have to look out for are things like bottles and cans, buttons, metallic items, things like farm implements, old bottles that don't have caps. Also glass, ceramic, or porcelain fragments, anything that doesn't look recent. So it should have a weathered appearance. It could have outdated technologies like before can openers or screw-on tops. You may also find building foundations or chimneys and wells. So those are also something to stop work and give us a call for an archaeological evaluation. So the main things to remember is if you think you see remains or artifacts, please notify your supervisor, stop work immediately within 100 feet of the find, and call the O&M support unit, either myself or Joe, and we'll get archaeological guidance out to you guys. And this was really just a short summary of the different things you might encounter out there. We printed out and gave out booklets last year with a lot of really nice photos. If you would like a copy of that, I would be happy to get it for you. Just give me a call. So here again is my contact information. And now we're going to take questions, if possible, and then we will go into the biological portion of the presentation. Thank you.
All right, now I'll talk about salmonids in Santa Clara County. So we have two main species of salmonids in Santa Clara County, the steelhead, which is the top picture, and the Chinook salmon, which is the bottom picture. Steelhead are federally listed as threatened in Santa Clara County. Chinook salmon do not have federal or state endangered or threatened listings in our county. However, they are a species of special concern within our county, so they do have some protections. Both species are anadromous, so what anadromy means is they migrate upriver from the sea to spawn in our creeks and rivers. So they're coming out of the ocean into our creeks and rivers to spawn and reproduce. On top of those species, we also have a couple other special status species such as the green sturgeon and longfin smelt that do have the possibility of occurring within our counties. Now these two species are generally in our tidal areas where we don't tend to do a lot of dewatering and work with them. They're more of a special case circumstances, so we'll go over that with you depending on your project site and location. We won't get into too much detail about them on these slides. All right, now we're going to begin talking about steelhead life history. Steelhead began entering our creeks in Santa Clara County from December through March as the bulk of the migration. Fish can enter a little bit earlier than that, a little bit later, but generally the majority of the fish are coming in December through March. Steelhead will generally travel as far upstream as they possibly can, either to a dam or some other kind of physical barrier within our creeks. The females generally will build the nest or redd first, and then the female lays the eggs and the male will come in and externally fertilize the eggs. After spawning, steelhead do have the ability to travel downstream back out to the ocean, where then they generally spend a year before they come back. And it has been documented for this to happen at least 4 times, but that's generally pretty rare. This is a very taxing process on these fish, and a good majority of them don't make it back out to the ocean. However, they do have that ability where they will spend 1 year and kind of restore all that energy reserves they lost during this process. After the eggs are laid, they're usually in the gravel for 3 to 4 weeks before they hatch. Then the hatched fish remain in the gravel for generally a period of 2 to 3 weeks before they emerge from the gravel, and then they'll spend 1 to 3 years within our creeks and rivers in Santa Clara County before they eventually return to the ocean, where they'll spend 1 to 4 years growing in the ocean before they return to begin the spawning process again. All right, now for Chinook salmon. So generally, Chinook salmon begin entering our creeks and rivers in August, and then this generally goes through December. We've seen fish as late as January, but once again, that's the bulk of the migration happens at that time period. Salmon, unlike steelhead, don't travel as far upstream to spawn. They're generally found in the lower portions of our creeks and rivers. For example, we'll see these salmon spawning down by the airport as well as in downtown San Jose. So you can see these fish will generally be in the lower reaches of our creek systems. That's not always the case. They can and will move into the higher areas. We've seen them in Alamitos Creek, which is much higher up in the watershed. But for the most part, a rule of thumb is they'll be lower down the water in the watershed. Females construct the reds similar to steelhead. They'll deposit the eggs and then they'll be externally fertilized by the male. Once again, that's same as steelhead. And in this picture, you can actually see that process happening. The male there is externally fertilizing the eggs. Unlike steelhead, all adults will die after spawning. So Chinook do not return to the ocean. After the eggs are laid, they're in the gravel for 6 to 9 weeks. The fry then remain in the gravel for another 4 to 6 weeks after hatching, and then they emerge. And once they emerge from the gravel, unlike steelhead, they travel downstream and begin their out migration. Very slow pace. They're feeding as they're going out, growing, getting bigger, which generally takes 1 to 7 months depending on certain factors. So they won't spend a minimum of a year in our creeks and rivers like steelhead do. They begin migrating back out to the ocean immediately after hatching and emerging from the gravels. And once they return to the ocean, they'll spend 1 to 4 years in the saltwater growing until they return back to our creeks and rivers to spawn again. So now I'm going to go into salmon red. So this is for salmon and steelhead, and kind of go over what is a red, where you're going to find it, and how to avoid it, and some things that might cause a false red to occur in our creeks and rivers. So the first thing, what is a red? So a red is basically just a nest built in the gravel by the female salmon and steelhead. And when these fish come into our systems to spawn, they're seeking out specific habitat and hydraulic features where they lay or construct their reds. Generally, salmon reds are much larger than a steelhead red, just because they're on average a larger fish. So they will construct larger reds. Salmon reds, like I mentioned before, tend to be downstream portions of our creeks and rivers. So they don't generally migrate as far upriver as a steelhead would. Now, it doesn't always happen, but for the most part, that's how it works. All right, red location we're going to talk about now. So what are these fish seeking out? Where are the areas they're looking for to build these reds? That's kind of what we're going to talk about and focus on in this slide. So they're looking for a couple main things: specific hydraulic and habitat features. And what are those? So generally the main area they're looking for is the pool tail riffle head transition zone. So that's kind of where your pools beginning to end, shallow up into the riffle, and the riffle's cresting over and dropping off, and you have that high velocity water going down through the riffle, shallow water. So the water's not only going over the riffle, there's also water going through the gravels underneath and through the riffle. So it's also going through the gravels. And what that is called is hyperharic flow, is that water going through the gravel. And that's important because when the fish build their reds at this area, or build their nest, they're laying the eggs in the gravel. They're being buried, as you can see in that top picture there, in what's called the tail spill. And when they're buried in the gravel, they need the water going through the gravel to oxygenate the eggs. So that's very important feature they're looking for, that transition point where that hyperharic flow is occurring to oxygenate the eggs. They're also, to get the water to flow through the gravel, it needs to be the appropriate substrate size. So you can't have too many fines and too much fine material, which can bury and suffocate the eggs and not allow the oxygenated water to reach the eggs. So you need nice porous substrate, think gravel, cobbles, stuff with a lot of crevices and nooks and crannies and stuff where that water can flow through it. And then also water depth is very important. So if the water's too shallow, the fish aren't able to actually physically make the red. There's a high likelihood that the red could potentially become dry as the water recedes. So that's another important feature. So these fish, when they're coming to these areas, they're looking for 4 distinct things: that pool tail riffle head transition zone, which also contains that hyperharic flow, correct substrate size where they're not going to deoxygenate the eggs, and then appropriate water depth. All right, now we'll discuss the features of a red and what a red actually looks like, and kind of the structure of it and how to kind of identify it. So the red has 3 main areas that you can see here. So there's the pot, there's the egg packet, and there's the tail spill. So I'll go in depth on those a little bit. So the pot is actually the area where the female comes in and she'll actually lay on her side and use her tail facing upstream into the current to flap her tail against the bottom of the gravel and use the current, and that kind of brings the gravel up into the water column and uses the current to push that downstream, which then creates tail spill. And you can kind of see that in the picture at the bottom there, what's going on. So then once she does that, she'll go lay the eggs in the pot area, kind of more towards the back end of it, and then the male will come in, fertilize those, and then she'll go in front of that pot and do the same thing, building a new pot. However, that tail spill from the new pot will cover and bury the egg packets and protect them. So the eggs on a finished red are not going to be in the pot area. They'll actually be downstream in the tail spill material. So most people would want to assume they're in the actual depression pot that the female created in the stream bed. However, they're actually more downstream of that. So in this picture at the bottom there, they'd be more to the right than in that depression where she created that. So generally this causes, as you can see, a disturbed area, so that's a key feature you're looking for. So you have the pot, the tail spill, the egg packets will all kind of be in this area. So we want to avoid those reds, because obviously if you step in the tail spill or on the eggs, they're going to get squashed and you can kill them. And if you're walking around it, you know, you can kick up fines that could suffocate the eggs and different things like that. So those are the main features of a red that we would look for. So then some things that could make a red, or a false red, I should say, that might look like a salmon red but is not. Lamprey are one of them, and that's what you see here in this picture example. So the lampreys at the top, it's kind of this eel-like fish with a suction mouth, and what they do when they come into our rivers and creeks, they actually use their suction mouth to pick up rocks and move them out of the red, creating a kind of a pot area or depression. However, it's easy to discern the difference because they're using their mouth to move the rocks, so they move them in a circular pattern around their red. So you will have rocks not only downstream, but you also have disturbed rocks placed upstream, and that's a telltale sign. A salmon red, you would never see those disturbed rocks actually pushed upstream, where in a lamprey you would see that. Some other ones, duck dabbles, ducks dabbling in the creeks can create depressions and disturbances in the gravel that might appear to be a red. Humans, people walking in the water, footprints, different things like that can cause disturbances where it might look like that a salmon or steelhead spawn there, but it's not. And then sometimes just natural scour, how the water flows in creeks, can kind of create that illusion of a steelhead or salmon red. So it does take some experience to determine what is and isn't a red. I don't expect all you folks here to be experts on this and to do that, but it's just something to be aware of when you're out in the field. And if you have anything that you think looks like a red, feel free to call us biologists at the SMP and we can come out and take a look at it. But it's not your job to figure out what is and isn't a red, but we would like you to be aware of it and just kind of have a basic understanding of what they are. And then the next thing is where to cross, so we don't, if we are working in the wetted channel, how to avoid impacts to reds if they are there potentially. So the main thing, as you can see in this picture, is that we want to avoid the pool tail head of riffle area, so that transition zone I was talking about before, because that's generally where you're going to find the bulk of your reds. So if we want to avoid that area at all costs, we don't want to be walking through that. So what's that mean? So we want to cross generally at the downstream portions of riffles. So as you can see in this picture, I have the arrow going across the channel at the downstream end, and that's where you're least likely to encounter a red, as well as the water is generally shallower there. It's a little slower moving at that point at the end of the riffle, so it's generally easier area to cross anyways. And another important thing, we don't want to be walking up the riffles, up or down. So if you can at any time, it's important to get out of the water or get as close to the edge as you could if you need to walk up and down riffles. Because not only are fish utilizing these areas to spawn, and they're also utilizing these areas to rear. Riffles are very important feeding areas for juvenile salmon and steelhead. They're utilizing those areas to grow. So if we're walking up and down them and disturbing them and pushing the fish out of those areas, that's not beneficial either. So at all costs, we want to kind of avoid riffles if we can. If we need to cross to the downstream end, avoid the pool tail head of riffle transition zone. And if you can, just walk out of the water. It's just better that way too. So yeah, we can answer any questions on that if you guys have any in the chat section, and we'll continue on.
Biological work windows are the timelines that your biological clearance is valid. And these work windows are determined by the sensitive species that are on site. So in areas with sensitive amphibian species like the California red-legged frog or the tiger salamander, work must be completed within 7 days of the biological survey. For areas with least Bell's vireo, work must be completed within 5 days of the biological survey during the nesting season, March 15th through July 31st. And for nesting birds, work must be completed within 7 days of the biological survey.
All right, now we're going to discuss some of the amphibians and reptiles in Santa Clara County. So the first one we have here is the California tiger salamander. So these are state and federally threatened species. They're a fairly large salamander with black and yellow molting. They're pretty obvious. And these spend the majority of their time underground and living in rodent burrows and other burrows and crevices in the ground where they're staying cool and moist out of the heat of the sun in California. And the only time they really come out of their burrows is to reproduce. So they'll come out in the wintertime once the rains begin, and they'll start moving to stock ponds and different pooled and ponded water areas where they'll mate and reproduce and lay their eggs there, and they can and then the juveniles will hatch in the ponds, spend some time in the pond before they dry up, and then as the pond begins to dry up, they'll metamorphosize into salamanders, and they'll make their journey back looking for new animal burrows and holes to live in. So when we're doing surveys with these guys, it's generally done at night, because that's, if you're going to see them, they're going to be generally in the evening times at night when it's cooler and more moist. And they'll get one daytime and one nighttime survey with a 7-day clearance window for these species. And that's year-round. Those windows are year-round for those. And for us to be doing these surveys, biologists need to be approved by CDFW in writing. California red-legged frogs. So these are federally threatened species that occur throughout our county along creeks and ponds and different water bodies and areas. So for these species, they're a medium-sized frog, smaller than a bullfrog, bigger than a tree frog, and they don't always have red legs. That's a common misconception. That's not one of the main ways to identify them. The main way we like to identify this species is what's called the dorsal lateral fold, and that's the ridge you can see running from the back of the eye towards the hind legs on either side of the body there. You can see the one here in the picture. So that's distinct to these frogs. It's a very obvious trademark that you can see on them when you're doing surveys for them. And they'll spend most of their time near the creek. You know, they'll venture a little bit away from the creeks in the upland areas to feed and stuff. But for the most part, they're amphibians, so they do need that moist, wet environment to survive. And we'll do one daytime and one nighttime survey for these species, and they'll get a 7-day clearance window. So not only do we have to keep an eye out for the listed amphibians I mentioned before this, but when we're doing dewatering and our different projects which could dry out the creek channels, we do need to keep an eye out for other native vertebrates. So, you know, tree frogs and western toads and different things like that, which could be reproducing in our creeks, and we see this quite often. So sometimes we'll have to hold off and wait if there is a large amount or a significant amount of, whether it's tadpoles or egg masses or whatever it may be in the creek channel before we dewater. So we got to make sure either they're metamorphosized where the frogs, or they can get out of their own way and move out of the site, or we just need to wait for them to get to that point. Some reptiles that we can find in our county. So western pond turtle are a species of special concern on permits. It can be easily confused with the red-eared slider below. So the western pond turtle is a native species to this area, can be found along our creeks. Somewhat common, and so just something to be aware of. Generally, we have the ability they can get out of their own way, so we'll just kind of work around them, or we can relocate them. But if we do surveys, and we will identify them and let you know if they are present. And we'll be on site during dewatering or anything like that, which has a potential to impact them. Then, like I mentioned, the red-eared slider below it is non-native invasive species that generally tends to outcompete the western pond turtle. Just generally, they're given up from the pet trade and stuff like that. People release them into our creeks, and they don't always have that red ear, so sometimes they can be difficult to distinguish from a western pond turtle if you're looking at them from far away, or they dive in the water real quick, things like that. So you're not always able to see those guys and determine if it is a western pond turtle, if it's a red ear slider. So So they can be easily confused, but just something to be aware of. Those guys don't have any special protection, and we'll generally move them out of the area if we do encounter them.
Hello, my name is Jeff Lewis. I'm an associate biologist with the Stream Maintenance Program. As we work closer to the bayfront, there's a set of species that is associated with the salt marsh. Salt marsh is a habitat characterized by plants that are adapted to deal with saline or salty conditions. Two of these species are the salt marsh harvest mouse and the ridgeways rail, both pictured here. When working around these species, or in the range where these species may be, biologists are needed on site to monitor the construction to ensure that we avoid having negative impacts on these species. Also, when working around these species, no work occurs within 2 hours before or after extreme high tide events, 6.5 feet or above. This is generally a tide which covers the plane of the marsh with water. The first of these species is the California ridgeways rail. It's a state and federal endangered species. It's a medium-sized bird with this curved orange bill, an overall brownish color, and very large feet. This species is very good at hiding. Generally, biologists will survey for this species primarily through listening for its calls. When we're working in the area that has potential to be ridgeways rail breeding habitat, we do not do that work during the breeding season for this species. That season is January 15th through August 31st. So most of these sites on the bayfront, we do that work later in the work season in order to avoid the breeding season for this species. Another of these species is the salt marsh harvest mouse. This is a mouse that's closely associated with the salt marsh plant pickleweed. The mouse in pickleweed is pictured here. Salt marsh harvest mouse is an endangered species, and it's closely tied to pickleweed marshes. When working around the range of the species, biologists will be on site monitoring that work. While we're working in a site where a biologist is monitoring for salt marsh harvest mice, you see a mouse or other rodent on the work site, please notify the biologist. The dusky-footed woodrat is a species that builds lodges in the riparian corridors of a large portion of Santa Clara County. In areas where the dusky-footed woodrat may be present, biologists will survey the site within 14 days prior to the initiation of work activities. If we find any woodrat lodges in the area we survey, we'll tie blue flagging above them to mark their location and establish a 5-foot buffer around each woodrat lodge in which work may not occur. We do have the potential to relocate woodrat lodges if they are in places that are prohibiting essential work. However, that process requires that we consult with CDFW and give them a plan. Biologists have to go out at night in order to relocate the woodrat lodge. So it's a significant process, but if you do run into a situation in which woodrat lodge may need to be relocated, please consult with biologists. Here are some examples of woodrat lodges. They are typically mounds of sticks. They can be of varying size. Some of them are just a couple feet tall, some of them are several feet tall. They are frequently at the base of a tree or within poison oak. However, they can be built within the limbs of a tree, so they may be overhead in some cases. Throughout our work area, we may encounter nesting birds. The district protects nesting birds for several reasons. To start with, the protection of nesting birds is in line with our stream stewardship mission, and we have a set of internal nesting bird guidelines that direct us to protect nesting birds. Externally, we're regulated by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife under a set of codes that protect nesting birds. And we're regulated by federal laws, such as the Migratory Bird Treaty Act and the Bald Eagle Protection Act. The Migratory Bird Treaty Act is a federal law dating from over 100 years ago that makes it unlawful to pursue, hunt, take, capture, kill, attempt to take, capture, or kill any migratory bird, any part, nest, or eggs of any such bird. How does the district protect nesting birds? We implement our district nesting bird guidelines as well as the provisions within our permits. These involve pre-construction or pre-activity surveys for nesting birds. These surveys are typically done by a biologist, but some of you may have been certified as designated individuals to survey for nesting birds under a limited set of circumstances. As much as possible, we try to time projects to avoid the nesting bird season, especially in areas where there are likely to be large numbers of bird nests. We have this training program, as well as our designated individual nesting bird survey training program. When we find bird nests, we establish buffers around them. And once we have an active bird nest, we may return to that nest to monitor it. Under the SMP permits, the nesting bird season is considered to be January 15th through August 31st. During this season, we are required to survey for nesting birds prior to work. Outside of this season, we would still protect nesting birds in the unlikely event that we encountered them. These photos have some examples of the types of bird nests you might see out there. These include cup nests that you might find in a tree, and which might be the thing that you typically think of with a bird nest. But it also includes nests that might be on the ground, including nests of species such as killdeer that like to nest on our gravel roads. This also includes swallows that could be nesting under bridges.
A buffer is a no-work zone around a nest to protect it from disturbance. A buffer can vary in size from 50 feet to half a mile for bald and golden eagles, and that buffer size is going to be dependent on the species of bird. A biologist can identify either a smaller or larger buffer depending on a site-specific evaluation. So these are just guidelines for how big these buffers should be.
Buffers are marked in the field using the color blue. This is typically in the form of blue flagging. Blue flagging may be tied to trees, other vegetation, or structures such as fences at the edges of the buffer. Occasionally, buffers may be marked through blue paint on the ground. It's particularly common in the case in which a nest may be on the road. You may find a situation in which we mark a blue stripe of paint across the ground. Occasionally, when there's nothing to tie flagging onto, we may also pound posts into the ground on which we may tie flagging. After a biologist has established a buffer, this buffer should be maintained, and any direction regarding the access routes or distances in which work must stay from the nest should be followed. If you should run across a bird nest during the course of your work, first stop work in the area immediately. Then contact an SMP biologist. We will give you guidance on how to proceed. Once a buffer has been established around a nest, biologists may return to the nest to monitor the nests, determine whether the nest is still active, and therefore whether the buffer is still warranted. The amount of time in which birds stay in a nest may vary depending on the type of bird. Some ground nesting birds, chicks, leave the nest within a few hours. Cup nesting birds tend to stay in the nest for a few weeks. Platform nesting birds, such as raptors, may stay in the nest for longer than a month. If you have a nest with a buffer around it, and you think the nest may no longer be active and would like biologists to check, please contact an SMP biologist. In most cases, birds that nest on the ground receive a 25-foot buffer around the nest. However, in certain cases, that buffer may be larger. This is the case for the burrowing owl, short-eared owl, and northern harrier. All of these species nest on the ground, but receive a 250-foot buffer around the nest rather than a 25-foot buffer. If you should have any questions about buffer distances, buffers that have been established around nests, or any other questions around nesting birds, please contact one of our SMP biologists. Burrowing owls are state species of special concern. They typically nest underground in old ground squirrel burrows. As mentioned, burrowing owls receive a 250-foot buffer around occupied burrows. Mowing may occur within that buffer area if a biologist is monitoring the site. Occupied burrowing owl burrows may be determined by, of course, the presence of burrowing owls seen coming into or out of the burrows or standing next to the burrows, but they also may be detected through the presence of owl pellets or whitewash around the burrow entrance. If you see a burrowing owl or suspect that a burrowing owl is using a burrow, please contact an SMP biologist.
We also need to be aware of the Crotch's bumblebee and their nests. This species is under consideration for listing as threatened or endangered under the California Endangered Species Act. We don't expect everyone to be able to identify these species on their worksite, but if you do find a bee nest of any kind, please give the biologist a call and we'll go on site to determine whether or not this is a Crotch's bumblebee and what BMPs need to be put in place to protect the individuals and their nests.
Let's talk about where bumblebees nest and how to know if you have a bumblebee nest. So as far as nesting habitat, they will nest anywhere there are burrows. They will also use rock piles, fallen logs, bunch grasses, and human structures. They especially love bird boxes. Rodent burrows are the most common nest location. The size of the burrow doesn't matter as long as it can fit a bumblebee. So how do you know when you have a bumblebee nest? Well, the most obvious sign would be multiple bumblebees going into and out of a structure. Like I said earlier, it can be underground or it can be in a bird box, in a tree, but you're looking for concentrated bumblebee activity. Most of the time, bumblebees won't sting unless they're being harmed or they're defending a nest. So if you're being stung by multiple bumblebees, most likely there's a nest. So the picture here, if you look closely, there's multiple black and yellow bumblebees coming out of the ground. It looks like there are some roots and some broken vegetation. It looks like there is some type of excavation activity here, and now bumblebees are coming out. So that would be a sign of a nest. So like I mentioned earlier, bumblebee traffic, the movement of bees in and out of a structure, is a nesting sign. And that rate of movement depends on a number of factors, weather conditions. If it's warm, you're more likely to see bees coming in and out. But if it's wet, if it's cold, you're going to see a lot slower bee traffic. So you might see one bee every 20 seconds, or several minutes may go by without a bee entering or leaving. The nest is still active.
Certain areas of our county are known to have special status plant species, rare or endangered plants, or sensitive natural vegetation communities. While these are extremely rare within the SMP work area, in the chance that we do encounter one of these areas, work would need to be reviewed and approved by a botanist. Application of herbicide below ordinary high water follows our in-stream work season. Again, this season is typically June 15th to October 15th, although its end date may vary depending on conditions such as rainfall and observations of steelhead migration.
Good morning or good afternoon, whichever time this recording is being played. My name is Kendra Boutros. I'm an Associate Water Resource Specialist in the Environmental Planning Unit. And today I'm going to go over a stormwater awareness training, going over some permit requirements and inspection requirements that we have at Valley Water. Here's an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to go over some of the regulatory background for the stormwater permit requirements. I'll go over the municipal regional permit requirements in general, and specifically the ones related to municipal operations, the SWIP inspection requirements, different potential pollutants that we might see at different material storage yards or corporation yards that we have at Valley Water, the best management practices that can be put in place to help control those potential pollutants, and then lastly go over a little bit of the best management practices for graffiti removal. So where did these requirements, these stormwater permit requirements come from? So it all stemmed from the Clean Water Act from 1972, which is a federal law to help protect our surface waters, which then created the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permits, which is administered by the US EPA, which is then delegated to the state and regional water resources control boards. In California, we have 9 different regions. But in our region, Region 2, we have the San Francisco Bay Municipal Regional Stormwater NPDES permit, or MRP for short. You may have heard of some other NPDES type permits as well that come up. There's also the construction general permit and the potable water purveyor permit. But just wanted to mention those here. We won't be going into those today. If we don't comply with the permit requirements in the municipal regional permit, we could face notice of violations or potentially high fines based on the amount of discharge per day. So under the municipal regional stormwater permit, we're a permittee along with 72 other agencies throughout the region, including other flood control agencies as well. The main goal or purpose of the permit is to help control urban runoff, to protect waterways, and that includes stormwater runoff that came into contact with potentially polluted sources, and then also prohibits discharge of non-stormwater to storm drains and waterways directly. The permit, it has about 22 provisions in there, which outlines a lot of different requirements for different activities that a municipality may have. But today we're going to be focusing mostly on provision C2. Provision C2, or the Municipal Operations Provision, requires permittees to ensure appropriate best management practices are implemented to control and reduce non-stormwater and polluted stormwater discharges from entering our storm drain or water courses during regular operations, inspections, routine repair and maintenance activities at our municipal facilities and within our infrastructure. So it has very specific requirements on making sure that we're implementing those BMPs, routinely inspecting our facilities. If there's any issues found during those inspections, correcting them within 10 business days, as well as implementing specific BMPs such as plumbing all facilities and equipment wash areas to the sanitary sewer, using dry cleanup methods when cleaning up debris and spills instead of using like a hose to wash down an area. And then lastly, ensuring that our outdoor storage areas that may contain pollutants are covered and or bermed before a rainy season. Another requirement that's in Provision C2 is to develop and implement a SWIP or SWIPI, which is the Stormwater Pollution Prevention Plan for each of the applicable facilities that a municipality has. So for us, we have our corp yards and our material storage yards and even the water treatment plants. These SWIPs have been required to be in place since 2010. And actually the first SWIP that we've had at Valley Water was created in 2001. The main goal or objective of these SWIPs is to identify and evaluate the pollutant source at each specific facility and implement the best management practices that would be best for reducing or controlling those potential pollutants from entering our stormwater systems, both in the wet and dry season. The SWIP document is a guidance document that goes over the facility description and overall layout of the site to be able to best identify where those anticipated pollutants are and where to implement the BMPs to control those pollutants. It also lists the pollution prevention team, the Valley Water contacts that help implement the plan and also respond to any illicit discharges that may happen on site. It also has a summary of the inspection forms and the overall permit requirements as well. SWIP inspections are required to be completed each year in August or September. They are normally conducted by the environmental planning unit, either myself or someone from my team, and we will coordinate with those listed in the pollution prevention team for each specific facility to notify them of the upcoming inspections and also work with them if any issues are found during those inspections to get them corrected within 10 business days. Those inspections and any resolutions are required to be reported out to the water board in our annual stormwater permit, which is submitted on by September 30th each year. Now, the municipal regional permit is Valley Water's responsibility as an agency as a whole, and it's better to conduct these internal inspections than to receive an inspection from water board staff. So much rather see me walking around than water board. So where are all these SWIP sites that we have? So we have 8 SWIPs in place at Valley Water. We have one for the headquarters, Courtyard, Almaden campus, and Winfield facilities each. We also have one for each of the water treatment plants, and then we have one for the Camden Yard, which filed in the Winchester Yard and Willow Yard, respectively, and the Brokaw Yard, which we put Aborn Yard and Prospect Yard under as well, since they are smaller yards. And there's a lot of area to cover for all these inspections that are completed annually, but the practices, best management practices that are used to protect waterways are very similar, but each site is slightly specific to what type of activity is happening there. During inspection, what we're looking out for is any of the potential pollutant sources that might be entering the waterway directly through the outlet systems or the storm drain inlets if those are on site. Also assessing BMP effectiveness to see if they need to be refreshed at all before the wet season, such as filter bags or maybe the wattles, or replacing the tarps over material storage piles. We're also looking out for any active non-stormwater discharges and their characteristics, like if there's oily sheen or smell or things like that. If those discharges are found during inspection, they need to be stopped immediately. So that involves calling the facility manager to get them involved, notifying them of the discharge, and then also reporting it to the pollution hotline in case there are any hazardous materials being discharged at that point. There are a variety of different potential pollutants that can be seen at our material yards or courtyards that we want to keep an eye out for, but the main ones at our courtyard and material storage yards is dirt or sediment, sand, and sand. While we wouldn't really think of these as a very hazardous pollutant, they can cause a lot of issues, especially during the first flush of a rainy season, where it can significantly drop the oxygen levels in our waterways, which we want to protect for our fish species that are in there, so it's not too cloudy for them, and they're able to nest appropriately. Some other potential pollutants that are a little bit more hazardous that we might see from our operations is chlorine from potable water runoff, metals from rusting equipment, automotive fluids, litter and trash, pesticides that aren't appropriately applied, and then soap or even paint as well. To protect our waterways from those potential pollutants in the last slide, there are several different types of best management practices we can implement at our yards. Some typical ones that we'll see can be either structural or non-structural. Structural ones are usually the putting in place wattles or tarp coverings for our material storage piles as seen here at Prospect Yard, or putting in place inlet protection devices such as filter fabrics and gravel bags or gravel in itself to reduce dirt from entering the inlet, which can also bind with a lot of heavy metals or pesticides, or even other more structural methods such as creating overhang structures over materials that may have pollutants such as zinc from tires or excess dirt, or gas and oil from our fueling stations. And some non-structural control methods are usually good housekeeping, making sure we're sweeping up with a broom for any pollutants that were spilled, using those dry control methods, covering up dumpsters during rain events to make sure that no garbage juices are flowing off, and even just taking this training is also seen as a good housekeeping, or sorry, non-structural control best management practice. Now, in the next few slides, I'm going to go over some good and not so good examples of what we've seen in past inspections to give you an idea of like what to look out for while you're on the field. So here we have our Winfield sand pile, and you can see on the left-hand side a good example of it being really well buttoned up, especially during our rainy season coming up. We have the wattle in place, as well as tarp coverings to make sure that it's all tightly contained and it's not running off to the storm drain that's downstream of this. Whereas here it's looking a little messy, probably was in preparation for upcoming work, but we want to make sure that this is all covered when not being actively used, and having the wattles in place to help reduce runoff of sand. Here's a smaller example of making sure our material storage areas are being kept tidy and buttoned up before the rainy season. This is over at the Camden Yard. You can see the wattles are put in place nicely and the tarp coverings, and it's all buttoned up for the rainy season so that excess dirt or sediment or those fine particles are not running off into Guadalupe Creek right next door. Whereas on the right-hand side, you can see there's a lot more potential for that to run off into Guadalupe Creek. Here's a good example of a good housekeeping BMP for making sure that our dumpsters are closed or have tarp covering over them, especially during the rainy season between October and April. This is actually a City of San Jose ordinance as well. It's important to try to keep these covered. As I mentioned, we don't want any garbage juices during the rain event washing off into our storm drain outlet that connects straight to Guadalupe River behind the courtyard. This goes also for any construction sites or projects that have dumpsters on site. Want to make sure they're covered at all times when they're not being used, even during the dry seasons, to eliminate any wind from blowing material out from them. Here's a good example of using a wattle to make sure to keep sediment runoff from getting onto our hard surface here. You can see on the right-hand side when the wattle wasn't in place, we're getting a lot of runoff from refilling of trucks with the fire hydrant here, but with the wattle, it's able to help control and contain it a little bit better. Here we have a good example of dry cleanup methods under a good housekeeping best manager practice. So sweeping up that loose dirt and sand from our equipment when it comes back in from the yard. It's important to try to clean this up as frequently as possible, just so one, makes tracking a lot less likely to happen from outside of our facility, and then also helps with the management of our culvert BMP, which is behind the tractor over here, less likely having to clean it as often, replacing the filter fabric and the gravel. Another good housekeeping practice, picking up litter and trash. So Here we have over at the Burkar yard, there's some excess trash that was left over on the right-hand side, and making sure that it's getting picked up before the rainy season, and just in general during the dry season so that wind won't blow it around and send it to Coyote Creek, which is just to the left of this photo. Good equipment storage is also considered a best management practice for our yards, making sure that heavy items are lifted and or covered if they're starting to rust off the ground so that they have less potential to come in contact with stormwater during the rainy season, as well as just making sure packages are, not being ripped up and causing any additional litter or debris from blowing around or going into our waterways or storm drain systems. Here is a example of inlet protection that we see over at the headquarters courtyard. This is around the outlet structure that leads to Guadalupe River. We see the filter fabric and the gravel is all fresh and ready to capture the runoff for the rainy season that's coming up. And this is why I mentioned earlier, it's important to try to sweep up any excess dirt or debris earlier on so that we can reduce the amount of pancaking of the dirt from getting into the gravel here, so that it can be effective throughout the entire wet season at reducing this from overtopping and going into the Guadalupe River. Here's what the culvert BMP at the courtyard looks like during a rain event. You can see it's working really hard right now to capture and making sure all this water that has a ton of sediment and potentially even oily runoff mixed in there from entering into the outlet that goes to the Guadalupe River. If we're able to keep up with good housekeeping practices like sweeping up the dirt earlier on, making sure the area is clean before the rainy season, it reduces the maintenance needs on these filtration and treatment devices and makes them more effective longer throughout the wet season. Heading into the last couple slides here, and touch a little bit on graffiti removal BMPs, which are also included in the municipal regional stormwater permit requirements under provision C2. Valley Water primarily uses a contractor to conduct this work using the painting over technique, but a couple other removal techniques that other vendors might use is pressure washing or sandblasting. And we want to make sure with any of these techniques that the materials are being controlled appropriately, especially when they're working close to waterways. So using tarps to collect any potential spills, making sure things are covered appropriately and there isn't any paint chips or leftover material left at the site. Some other general best management practices related to graffiti removal is making sure attending appropriate training for how to implement each of those techniques, requiring those BMPs in our contract specifications is a good BMP method to meet those permit requirements. Blocking off any storm drains that are nearby, if it's over by a bridge or area, and vacuuming and sweeping up any solid waste and making sure to properly dispose of the waste or wash water that may have been used during that work. Lastly, here are a few key points I'd like you to take away from this presentation. So we have the annual SWIP inspections coming up soon for our material storage yards and corp yards in August and September. If any issues are found, those need to be corrected within 10 business days. If longer than 10 business days is needed, we need to come up with a compliance plan and justification for that extended correction time. Overall, good site management is the key to a successful SWIP and keeping our sites in compliance, especially right before a rainy season, making sure BMPs are in place and effective. If we do have any issues of non-compliance, it could result in a notice of violation or fines under the permit. And lastly, if you see any non-stormwater discharges or hazardous materials during your regular work activities or at the material storage yards, if you're there too, please call the pollution hotline to report it so that we can stop it immediately and then also provide any other additional corrective actions depending on the type of substance or discharge that was found during that time. If you have any additional questions, here is the Environmental Planning Unit surface water quality team members. Feel free to reach out to any one of us. We'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.